Welcome to Off Peak, the podcast about getting around in Los Angeles. I'm Barbara Bocave. You know, if there was ever anything designed to be taken for granted, it's a road. Especially here in LA. I spend so much of my time in a car on the road, I hardly ever think about it as a separate entity, as something that has a history. But it turns out roads do have a history, and that history has a lot in common with an episode of Game of Thrones, of all things. It's full of intrigue, conspiracies, and even violence. And that's because it's about a fundamental power struggle over who has the right of way. And you can see just how impassioned people can get about this when you look at an experiment going on right now in a bunch of cities around the country, where city planners are trying out something called road diets. The idea is to help drivers, cyclists, and pedestrians share the road in the most efficient and safe way. Now, last year, the city put Rowena in Silver Lake on a road diet, but the transition has been really rough. Traffic has gotten more congested, and it's driven cars into side streets. Neighbors and drivers are furious. And this is what happens when you try to challenge the status quo, that cars own the roads. But how did the automobile come to dominate roads in the first place? I set out to trace this surprising history, and I started right there where tempers are flaring, in Silver Lake.
Well, I'm waiting to cross the intersection here at Hyperion and Rowena on Friday afternoon. I can feel the tension. Cars, they're backed up all the way past Trader Joe's. I just saw somebody on a bike run the light. I feel like bikes and cars are out to get me, but it's funny. When I get on my bike, all of a sudden pedestrians are nuisances and cars are my sworn enemies. But then when I'm driving, I have no sympathy for pedestrians or bikes, and I just feel like everybody is in my way. It reminds me of that George Carlin joke.
Have you ever noticed when you're driving that anyone who's driving slower than you is an idiot? And anyone driving faster than you is a maniac!
How did we get to this place where everyone is fighting over who owns the road? Why don't we go back to the beginning of roads to figure this out? Yes, those are Hollywood dinosaurs. It turns out you need dinosaurs to tell this story. Because roads were not originally made for cars. You have to track down a few lost chapters in the history of the automobile to get the whole picture. You also need bike historian Carlton Reid.
I'm Carlton Reid, and I'm the executive editor of Bike Biz.
And guess what the name of his book is?
And author of Roads Were Not Built for Cars.
Carlton Reid says roads are much older than most of us think. A lot of them started life as Indian trails.
And even before the Indians would then stamp down these trails to go from their A to B, they were used for transhumans.
Transhumans, meaning animals.
So some of the earliest roads, including the road that goes to Washington, is a road that was actually first beaten down by mastodons.
Which means when you drive Highway 12 between Detroit and Aberdeen in Washington state, you're following a route pounded out 10,000 years ago by extinct megafauna. I wonder if mastodons had road rage. Anyway, roads started as ancient animal footpaths. Got it. And then we fast forward through a few millennia, and towns become cities connected by dusty roads, and little alleyways and cities evolve into honest-to-God city streets. And those streets are shared by pedestrians and horse-drawn carriages and cyclists and trolleys. But once horse-drawn carriages gave way to King Car, roads became all about cars, right? Even the legendary comedian and host of the 1961 documentary Merrily We Roll Along, the early days of the automobile, knows that.
You know, if there hadn't been a horse, the automobile would have had nothing to replace. And that great American romance between a man and his car might never have gotten started.
But Groucho Marx, that's not the whole story. Cars did not evolve from horse-drawn carriages.
Henry Ford was rapidly expanding his Greenfield village near Detroit and added the original bicycle shop of the Wright brothers to his display of early Americana. This building is where the first successful airplane was built by the two fathers of aviation.
Remember the Wright brothers? They were bicycle mechanics first. And did you know Henry Ford got some of his ideas for his famed assembly line by visiting bicycle factories? In fact, the first motor cars borrowed many of their key parts directly from the cutting-edge technology of their day, the bicycle.
The technologies were the same. You wouldn't have motor cars if you didn't have the ball bearings, the pneumatic tires, the different forms of lightweight steels that were developed for the red-hot technological revolution of cycles if it wasn't for those bicycle pioneers.
And there's more. The country's first freeway, the 110, right here in Los Angeles, wasn't originally intended for cars at all.
It can be said.
This is from the Los Angeles Times coverage of the 1899 groundbreaking for an elevated bike path called the California Cycleway.
That none of the new Southern California enterprises will be built upon surer foundations or be more certain of financial success. The wheel must have a path of its own between these two cities.
I'm Dan Coppell. I'm a writer. I live in Northeast Los Angeles, and I like to explore. We're standing here in Central Park in Pasadena. We're just a couple of blocks south of Old Town, and we're surrounded by all these streets with cars moving back and forth. 100 years ago, there would have been no cars. These paved streets would have been dirt roads. This park would have been a park, but in the middle of the park would have been the California Cycleway, which began right here and continued its journey south from this point.
It won't be a stylish marriage. I can't afford a carriage, but you look sweet upon the seat of a bicycle built for two.
On January 1st, 1900, throngs of cyclists lined up to pay a nickel to pedal along a 4-foot-wide wooden boardwalk.
It was 14 feet high. There was a stairway that led up to the toll booth where people would begin, and it was made of solid oak cut from the San Gabriel Mountains and milled at a lumber yard just south of us.
And this huge engineering project came about because in the 1880s and 1890s, bicycling was the next big thing. It was the golden age of the bicycle.
In lots of Hollywood movies now, you never get the impression that bicycles were all that important.
I'm looking for Josie Wales.
When you see the American West, you see the horses, and you see the carriages, and you see the Klondike gold diggers, and you see their pack horses and stuff, and the Conestoga wagons, etc. And you never, ever seem to get what was actually the dominant vehicle of the time, which was the bicycle.
According to the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, before the turn of the century, there were more than 300 bicycle manufacturers across the country, churning out 1 million bikes a year. 10,000 cyclists showed up for the opening of a cycle path from Brooklyn to Coney Island. The New York Times referred to the bike craze as the velocipede mania. And here in Los Angeles, somewhere between 30 and 40,000 wheels were in use, and scores of bike clubs sprang up, including the East Side Club in Boyle Heights, the Wanderers in Santa Monica, and the Crown City Club here in Pasadena. And a guy named Horace Dobbins, the one-time mayor of Pasadena, he looked at all this and he came up with a way to make a buck, with a cycleway in the sky.
Yeah, he was kind of like the Donald Trump of his day. You know, he said, you'll be able to go downhill pretty much in both directions.
Horace Dobbins was Pasadena's music man. He was like that guy on The Simpsons.
What'd I say?
Monorail.
What's it called?
Monorail.
That's right, monorail.
Monorail.
The Cycleway was a kind of monorail. Pasadena and L.A. were the two big cities then, just about 10 miles apart, and Dobbins understood that people needed to be able to get back and forth easily between them.
He looked at the best available transportation technology of the day, the bicycle, and said, how do we get bicycles quickly between these two cities? I don't want them down in those muddy old roads. I want them up on a boardwalk, and they'll be able to pedal freely between the two as long as they pay the fare. And that was his dream.
It was a really elaborate dream. Dobbins came up with the very modern idea of the toll booth, on and off ramps, and also planned for attractions along the route like a casino and a dairy, and even a stop for the Coston ostrich farm.
The ostrich feather hat was, something every fine lady needed to have. So you could eat ostrich egg omelets, buy ostrich feather hats, eat ostrich burgers.
Yes, ostrich farms were a thing back then. And all of this for a bicycle path. In fact, today, the 110 Pasadena Freeway uses much of the same right-of-way that Dobbins originally bought for his bike path in the air. But bikes didn't just shape the vision for the 110 freeway. Bikes made roads better all over America.
The world on wheels. Crude wheels. Wheels that bring discomfort and nervous strain to all who brave the open road.
Back before the turn of the 20th century, most roads in America were muddy and rutted, not suited at all to the bicycle.
Means a jarring crash to the aptly named bone shaker and towering penny farthing as they rattle through the countryside on hard and solid tires. Traveling is an ordeal. Its day is a pleasant...
Some of the roads connecting cities weren't even in use anymore because train travel had made them obsolete.
Railroads had an enormous effect on road transport. And what happened was people just stopped using roads. So there's about a generation and a half where roads had completely grassed over, had completely been forgotten. And, the tumbleweed, going down a road, well, that's what the roads were like.
You really saw this in England, where an extensive turnpike system was gutted by the railroads. At the dawn of the railway age, England and Wales had more than 1,000 turnpike trusts, managing 22,000 miles of toll roads. By 1864, Parliament voted to abolish the trusts because the turnpikes were nearly deserted. So many travelers and freight haulers preferred trains over stagecoaches. Wild, isn't it? Now roads are the most densely populated things on the planet, but back then many went fallow because of the railroad revolution. So when bicycling really took off, all sorts of cyclists started demanding better roads. And in America, these early adopter types, they were really wealthy, influential people like John Jacob Astor, John D. Rockefeller, and Diamond Jim Brady, whose bike was encrusted with diamonds.
A lot of leaders, a lot of American would-be presidents were on bicycles at this time. So it was quite easy. They were pushing at an open door in many respects.
They formed a group called the League of American Wheelmen and came up with effective strategies to get people, especially country folks like farmers, excited enough to be willing to pay more taxes to build new roads.
Mabel, honey, get your parasol. The road shows come to town.
The cyclists and the agricultural department, the U.S. government, would put on these road shows.
They would rent a whole train, stuff big machinery for making roads onto it, like a compactor and a steamroller, and scores of workmen.
And they would roll into town, and they would disgorge from these trains and create kind of like the Barnum and Bailey of sideshows in which to show farmers that if you lay out a few hundred feet of really good road, and then they showed them how their wagons would be able to get along this road in all weathers, how sensible that would be.
Those very same prominent wheelmen agitating for good roads became early adopters of automobiles and continued the cause using the same institutions and even the same tactics. Because...
Remember, the bicycle rider of today is the automobile driver of tomorrow.
Now, this is not to say that bicycles are the only reason roads and streets became smooth and paved. There were many other factors, and here are some very informed people we rustled up to summarize just a few.
Road-free delivery was introduced, and that meant delivery had to be reliable, so the post office needed better country roads.
In the late 19th century, the germ theory of disease started to become accepted, and it helped people understand that standing water and unpaved roads were some of the biggest threats to public health. So you started to see sewers and paved roads.
Thank you, Random Voices. So a number of things collided to create better roads, but bikes played a big part. And a lot of this bike history, it's been forgotten. The real question is, why does it matter if bikes played a bigger role in the history of who owned the roads? Why does it matter if in the end Americans freely chose the automobile as the dominant form of transportation? Well, maybe we didn't choose the automobile as freely as we think. In fact, when cars came on the scene, Americans hated them. Even Groucho Marx in that documentary about the early days of the car agrees with that.
Frankly, the first automobile didn't find a ready place in our hearts. In fact, it inspired downright hostility. These noisy, smoking stink wagons, said an Agri Farm Journal, are designed to frighten to death anything they can't flatten out. The very sight of one is enough to dry up a whole dairy herd.
Cars weren't just stinky, they were deadly.
I'm Peter Norton. I'm a historian. I'm the author of Fighting Traffic, The Dawn of the Motor Age in the American City.
In his line of work, Peter Norton does a lot of research by reading letters to the editor in very old newspapers.
People, when they were angry then, instead of posting on Facebook, they would post in their newspaper a letter to the editor. And the letters would often call drivers things like speed demon, road hog, joyrider, which is a word that had a more offensive connotation then.
Concerned citizens were upset because so many people were getting run over and killed by these road hogs. You see, in the early days of cars, people were used to spending time getting together, talking, hanging out in the streets. And there were no stop signs or traffic lights or even markings on the road. It was dangerous. How dangerous? More pedestrians were killed by cars in the first 4 years after World War I than all 50,000 American servicemen who died fighting in France. And most of them were children. Children who were used to playing safely in the street all day long. It was a bloodbath. Newspapers compared the automobile to Moloch, the pagan deity from the Old Testament that the ancient Ammonites supposedly sacrificed their children to.
There were depictions of automobiles being driven by the Grim Reaper, driving right over people in the street.
It was war on the roads. With all of this controversy, the big motor car manufacturers were having trouble selling cars in cities. The automobile companies knew if they were going to win this battle over the roads, they had to do something.
So they decided that the biggest threat to the future of the car in the city was the perception that speed is dangerous. And so what they needed to do was find another explanation for accidents, and their explanation was recklessness by drivers and also recklessness by pedestrians.
That was the car industry's plan. They made safety the pedestrians' problem. But how? Who doesn't love a safety first parade? Picture Syracuse, New York, December 1913.
Boy Scouts, volunteers, parents, city groups got together and promoted this phrase, safety first, to encourage people to use the streets safely.
And to get people on board with the idea that it's the pedestrians' responsibility to get out of the way of cars, the automobile industry helped popularize a new phrase.
Because the Automobile Club of Syracuse was involved, they also began to spread the word jaywalker as a kind of insult for people who walked in the streets wherever they wanted to.
A jay was slang for a country bumpkin.
They even hired one of those department store Santa Clauses to use a megaphone to ridicule jaywalkers to get them to stop jaywalking in the street. And this was at a time when most people had never heard the word.
And those Boy Scouts at safety parades gave out little cards that explained jaywalking and that it's not okay to get in the way of automobiles. But an even more decisive step in the evolution of streets becoming seen as car territory happened right here in Los Angeles around about 1920.
Studebaker! Studebaker!
Studebaker? Studebaker?
Yes, sir.
Big news, Studebaker.
In 1923, a guy named Paul Hoffman was the head of all the Studebaker dealerships in L.A. and the president of the Los Angeles Traffic Commission. He realized it was getting hard to sell more Studebakers because downtown was too crowded. There were streetcars and cyclists.
There were pedestrians in the way. There was no place to park.
There was hardly room for cars. So he decided L.A. needed an ordinance to get people out of the way.
Paul Hoffman was thinking, how do I make a big city a car-friendly place? He wanted Los Angeles to write an entirely new traffic ordinance, an ordinance that would say, no, pedestrians actually are not allowed to walk in the street wherever they want to.
But how do you get that law passed in a city hostile to cars? Well, how do you get any law passed? You cite a lot of research in support of it. But first, you need a supposedly independent scientific expert. Enter Miller McClintock.
When Paul Hoffman met Miller McClintock was broke. He had a new child with his wife, and he was a part-time business English teacher.
Hoffman plucked this Chaucer scholar out of obscurity and hired him to write a jaywalking law. He dubbed McClintock a bona fide traffic expert, so the press and the city government would take notice, and it wouldn't look like only self-interested car companies were behind the idea of a jaywalking ordinance.
And in 1924, beginning that summer, Miller McClintock wrote this ordinance, working with Paul Hoffman. They presented it to the city of Los Angeles that fall. They did all of the research themselves. The city didn't have to spend a penny.
The law banned pedestrians from the streets. They would only be allowed to cross at crosswalks, except where there was no traffic, and then they could only cross at a right angle. It passed in 1925, and just a year later, 10 more cities in California voted it into law, and that became a model traffic ordinance adopted by a great many cities throughout the United States.
Today, it is the ordinance that makes the street a place for motor vehicles and not for pedestrians.
So, Miller-McClintock is part of the lost history of why our roads are clogged with cars now instead of pedestrians and streetcars and bikes?
Yes, right. This Chaucer student became the head of his own traffic planning bureau, and Studebaker gave him a generous fund that he could use to train graduate students, and the whole first generation of American city traffic engineers came out of this Chaucer Scholars Traffic Bureau.
Have you seen her? Ain't she great? She's something you'll appreciate.
Say, I don't understand just who you mean.
You don't? Why, everybody everywhere is falling for her now.
Say, do you mean the new Ford?
I do, and it's a wow.
I'm sure the new Fords were a wow. And don't get me wrong, of course there were plenty of reasons Americans were excited about cars. In the Roaring '20s, we had cash to spare, and it was a wondrous thing to be able to travel so far, so fast. Most people had never been further than 10 miles from their own home before the car. It was revolutionary. The mass-produced affordable car gave drivers unprecedented freedom. This idea of America's love affair with the automobile, it's the usual explanation for why our American cities are so dominated by cars. But this doesn't tell the whole story. And this idea of America's love affair with the automobile, it didn't rise entirely organically like a phoenix from the ashes of our love affair with the bicycle. It was nudged along, in part, here in Los Angeles by companies like Ford and Studebaker and people like Miller-McClintock. And by Groucho Marx. He says Americans have a love affair with the automobile many times during that 1961 NBC documentary.
Didn't. It's like our romance with the automobile is still going on. The honeymoon ended along with a few other things in 1929. But we're still very much married to Lizzie. We don't always know how to get along with her, but we certainly can't get along without her. If that isn't marriage, I don't know what is.
According to historian Peter Norton, this is the first time the phrase love affair with the automobile ever cropped up in popular culture.
And ever since then, this has been the number one explanation for the automobile's incredible success in America, is this love affair story. His message was, there is no rational criticism you can offer against automobiles in cities, because we're talking about love here, and love is not something we subject to a rational analysis. Love is blind, love will find a way.
Now, when you see her, you'll agree she's just the thing for you and me.
I bet she's got most anything you'd ask.
Yes, sitting pretty. Yes, I am. With her, I'm always found.
Say, how about her chassis?
It's sure the best around. Now she's even learned to stop for every single traffic cop. Henry's made a lady out of Lizzie.
Another moral of this story is that we need to ask ourselves where the history we've heard came from. So there's a history of the automobile in the American city that has been forgotten. And it wasn't forgotten by accident. It was forgotten because the people who had the most interest in telling the story were the same people who wanted the city to be an automotive city.
So where does this leave us? When you look over this lost history of the bicycle and the car industry's role in winning domination over the American road, it looks more and more as if it wasn't foreordained that cars would become such a huge part of our transportation system, of the design of our cities, of our lives. Historian Carlton Reed.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, nobody predicted that cars would come along and take over the world. The first car makers certainly didn't think that. They just thought they had a novel way of getting around.
Maybe back in 1900, it could have all gone another way. Remember Horace Dobbins and his vision for that crazy 9-mile Pasadena to Los Angeles bike path in the sky? Well, it never got finished. Writer and cyclist Dan Capel.
Bicyclists would like to sort of blame the car and see Dobbins as sort of one of our own, but he just didn't have the wherewithal. It's expensive to build this stuff. It was then. He ran out of money very quickly, and he had some very, very powerful rivals, the Southern Pacific Railroad, Henry Huntington, all these huge corporations, huge entrepreneurs who had the same idea.
But Dobbins did build about a mile of this freeway for bikes, and for a brief time around the turn of the last century, cyclists soared to and from Castle Green to the Raymond Hotel, high above the dusty, rutted streets of Pasadena. I bet it was glorious. And in a way, we're at a similar crossroads now in Los Angeles with urban transportation, where it's not entirely clear who might dominate the road in the future.
Wilshire, Vermont Station. Welcome. Regular there.
Well, I'm literally at a crossroads and a crosswalk at 7th and Flower. When I worked here a decade ago, the sidewalks were deserted. Now there are throngs of people crossing the street. And there's so many ways to get around here. You can take the Expo line to Santa Monica. You can take the subway to North Hollywood. You can hop on a bus or an Uber or Lyft, or you can grab a bike at the brand spanking new downtown LA bike share station across the street. Cars are just one part of the mix. And for LA, that's really saying something. For Off Peak, I'm Barbara Bogave. This story was produced by myself, Sasha Woodruff, and The Glue. It was edited by Jim Gates with production management by Rachel Harper and engineered by Ravi Carmen for Metro. Special thanks to our actors Chris Doritas and Carl T. Wright. New episodes of Off Peak post every other week. Next time, we'll pull an all-nighter on the Owl, Metro's 110-year-old overnight bus service. And before we go, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us about the podcast or your story ideas. We're at offpeak@metro.net. And we're brand new, so if you enjoyed this episode, your likes on iTunes would be so appreciated. Till next time, I'm Barbara Bogave. This is Off Peak.